I began my day feeling very affirmed, I have to say. My daughter was flying back to college, and so my wife was up early, and they were headed out to the airport, and they're at the door. As they're trying to get out the door, our dog kind of came running in, so I had to kind of hold him back. And so there's all this chaos, and then there's like a call on my phone. I tell my daughter, "I love you," as she's going out the door. But my phone's going off too, my watch is triggered, and I'm like, what is this? And it was Siri, and she was responding to me, "You are the wind beneath my sails." And I thought, oh, Siri heard me say, "I love you" to my daughter, and Siri was sending a Siri response telling me so deeply and affirmingly that I was the wind within her life. It's true. And I thought, okay, I'll just hold on to that here. But we have far more deep things to affirm us this morning. We're concluding our series on building better relationships. And as we began our series, we listened and let our hearts take in the heart of God for us. When He was creating humanity, the scriptures at the beginning of Genesis depict how God creates humanity and says, it is not good for us to be alone. It's not good for us to be alone. We were not created for that. And God sees to that. And those words, I believe they've echoed throughout human history, that it is not good for us to be alone. They have echoed through many of our lives if we listen, that it is not good for us to be alone. And I found it very timely that this past week, two lives that are very astute in looking at our human experience right now, joined together in a conversation. It was Arthur Brooks, who's a journalist with The Atlantic, but a sociologist who has a whole program now on what is it that we really have to deal with in life to find satisfaction. And so he had brought on Dr. Vivek Murthy. Dr. Vivek Murthy, some may recognize, he is the U.S. Surgeon General. And he himself, who is a physician and you think would be focused mostly on only things medical per se, physical per se, has actually been one who has been voicing that one of the greatest challenges to our public health is loneliness. And he just wrote a book on this, so it's kind of striking a chord that many people recognize we've been trying to avoid, and that is the reality of our challenge to feel really connected. His book is entitled Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And in this conversation, Dr. Murthy speaks of how he recognizes as a physician in his years that there is such significance in loneliness, and he realizes how many people he's known that were extroverts and would be the life at a party and had large social lives, and then he would discover we're feeling deeply alone. And realizing that aloneness is not merely what it appears to be in the way that we may be social, we can still feel very disconnected, very alone, not really experiencing the level of real human connection we long for. And at that point, Arthur Brooks joins in and reminds him and speaks of a study that went on at the University of Rochester, where they took these students, I think they must have been seniors, and they asked them a question, what is it that are your goals? And then they had them write down their goals, and then they followed up a year later to see if they were happy, like where they ranked in terms of happiness. And what they discovered was that those who had extrinsic goals, meaning outward goals, wealth, fame, those lives had actually done fairly well. Many of them now had a lot more notoriety than they had ever known, and they had a lot more wealth coming in from their first careers than they had ever known. And they all rated the lowest in happiness. And those who had intrinsic goals and had said things like love and relationships are the things that I'm aspiring to find, were those that now rated themselves the most happy or happier than the others. Pointing to the fact that once again, it is ultimately those goals that will really truly satisfy. And Dr. Murthy responded, speaking of how this is what we always find within human history in terms of who is truly finding something more meaningful and the most meaningful. And then he goes on to say that we really know that at the very beginning of life. Look at any child, and they generally are not so aware or concerned about how famous their parents are or anything like that, or how big their house is. They generally are focused on that place of relationship, when people love them, when people show that kind of connection. And he says, and they hone themselves to what matters most. Look at a young life at the very core of its soul, and it will hone itself to what matters most. And then he says, but then we learn and we're taught by our world how to go try to find happiness in all these other things. And we miss it, and we're missing it deeply. And I think it's so vital for us to realize that. And then he goes on, and I want to quote him when he says, what I can tell you is about the conversations I've had with many patients at the end of their life. And what is remarkably consistent about those conversations, those last moments in someone's life, those last hours, last days, that I've been privileged, he says, to sit by the bedsides and hold their hands and look into their eyes and just hear their final reflections on life. He says, what people talk about in those final moments is not how big their office was, or the promotion they got, or the prestigious jobs, or how big their bank account was. What people talk about are always their relationships. They talk about the people they love, the people who they wish they had spent more time with. And then he says this, we don't have to wait for that time to realize what matters. That is worth hearing. We don't have to wait till that time to realize what matters. He says, we would live and look at life very differently if we truly built our life around people. Building our lives around people. That is in many ways what this series has been about. Building better relationships, because that is what really matters, that we were created for that. And that's the good news we began with, that we were not meant to be disconnected, but more importantly, we were created for connection, with the capacity for connection. That is what we were created to know. That's what God does in response, is make sure that that is there. But if we've lost that for so many reasons, and we've kind of lived in the darkness of that reality on how to love, this is what Jesus came to restore, is to teach us how to live back into the life of love with God, from God, and then with others that we were meant to know. And as we've noted from the paraphrase of the biblical book of Ephesians, chapter 5, where we've read each week, where it says, watch what God does, and then do it. Like children who learn proper behavior from their parents, observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. That's what we've been about, is learning to love like Jesus. And we notice here this quality, that he gave himself, not merely to get something, but to give. And in the giving itself, and that is the final quality we're looking at today, and we're coming around as we've looked at these different patterns in Jesus' life. It was the way that he gave himself for the sake of others. Love will give of ourselves for the sake of others. Jesus said, Matthew 20, the gospel, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And the Apostle John makes this even clearer when he says this, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. John saw this as the very definition of love. It was he who wrote that God is love. The very nature of God is love. And if we're trying to figure out, well, what does that mean? Because love can mean many things. He's saying here that it means it is the ability, the capacity to give ourselves, to lay down our lives for another. And the reality that he understands is that God And behind all of our existence has been this eternal community of Father, Son, and Spirit who is self-giving, each giving themselves to the other in this incredible way. They belong and they're bound to each other. We're meant to know that God creates our existence, and when he does so, he creates our capacity to live into and be a part of that kind of self-giving love. In other words, God revealed himself ultimately on a cross where Jesus gave his life for us to meet our deepest need, which was to be restored in forgiveness with God and to be back in that relationship. It is the very nature of God being known in that way. And for most of us, the honest truth is it is hard when we think about being self-giving people who give ourselves. Because we generally tend to live with the idea that the world is just we're in this world with limited capacity, limited resources. So I need to do what? I need to get as much as I can get. And this is really intense right now because there's nearly 8 billion people living on the earth. That's a lot of competition. So with 8 billion people, we really better get out there, take as much as we can get, keep as much as we can get, hoard as much as we can get, right? I mean, some of you still have toilet paper from the beginning of the pandemic, right? I mean, like, we really got to go after stuff. We're nervous. We can't think about giving away. That would be dangerous. I'm trying to figure out how to get the most attention, affirmation, affection I can get. That is our natural capacity. And something tells us, though, that we should be somehow thinking of others, and we struggle to do that. We struggle on a practical level. We struggle on a personal level. I know for myself, as I come around this quality, I just can't help but realizing how many times if I dare, and I try not to reflect about my own ability to be more interested in others than myself, that it's hard. That I often realize how selfish I am. That my thoughts are not always about others. I want to think they are. Sometimes they are, but so often they really are still about me. They can still be that way. That sometimes even when I'm even trying to be kind, sometimes it's even still about myself or how I'm perceived, that we tend to think of ourselves. It is not easy to kind of get out, if you will, of this kind of, gravity, if you will, of ourselves. But Jesus is trying to teach us that's exactly what we have the capacity to do. So as we look at Jesus, this is what I find is so vital in helping us. This is what I feel is essential if we're to be able to transition. A few things we can see. One is this, that love gives by choice. This giving that comes from love, it does so by choice. Notice that John did not say that Jesus had his life just taken from him. He said what? Jesus laid down his life. It came from his choice to do so, and that's a very significant part of what it means to be people who can give of ourselves to others. It is not merely that we're passively having things taken and consumed from us, but rather our power to be able to give. Jesus makes this really explicit when he says in John chapter 10, he says, the reason my Father loves me is that I laid down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. It's very powerful what Jesus is saying. He wants it very clear. I am not just here so that people can just take. I'm actually have authority. He's saying you and I each have our own authority, meaning we command what we do with our lives, and he's choosing to give himself. And that is very significant. It helps us know that this kind of ability to give ourselves to others, it is very different from being a doormat. Nobody would look at Jesus and say he was just a doormat to the whims and wishes and just did whatever people wanted of him. Not at all. You can see that he was in control of his own choices. That's what we're called to do, is see that in ourselves. And it helps us to understand that if our lives are merely caught up in a relationship that is abusive, that is merely using and abusing and is destructive, and we're merely the victims of that kind of abuse, we need to say that is a relationship to get out of. That is not love that is going on in that relationship. It is not a reflection of love merely to have people just take from you or use you. It is not serving you, it is not serving them, it is not honoring God. What is this about is the power to actually choose to give ourselves for a greater good. And that power of that choice is itself so significant because it really reveals to us our own potency. Your ability to make choices shows that you have the capacity to make a difference. And that is so important. You are never more powerful, never more potent than when you choose to do something that can influence, that can encourage, that can add to someone else's life. That is a power that you should not lose, but rather use. When God created us, He created us as that source of help for one another. That's the real reason. And yes, it's part of how He created Adam and Eve as complementary, as helpers to each other, but it really transcends that. We are all meant to be a gift to one another, to be those who can interdependently help one another. You are a gift, and that is vital. That is part of the identity that you and I are meant to say. So I'm going to invite you to dare to say out loud, you don't have to scream it, I am a gift to others. Would you dare to say that with me aloud? I am a gift to others. I don't say that because it's a feel-good statement. I say it because actually I think that's the identity that you and I need to embrace. We really need to embrace that we were meant to be, we have a responsibility to be a gift to others. You may recall that last week I'd mentioned that we do well to go back to what God was engaging with Cain and Abel. You know, this offspring from Adam and Eve, these two brothers, and Cain gets jealous of Abel. It's like Abel's getting maybe more attention, more affirmation. So what does Cain do? Hey, how can it? No, he doesn't. He strikes down his brother and kills him because he thought somehow he would fight off the competition. And what does it leave? Cain is now alone. And the truth is, when we keep trying to fight off other people's affirmation and attention, we end up alone. And then because we have this desperate need in life sometimes to keep trying to find affirmation and affection in all the wrong ways, through fame, through sex, we're just trying to feel that. And in the end, we end up feeling alone. What he didn't do was learn to be connected to his brother because they were mutually responsible. In fact, what does God say to him? Where's your brother? And remember, Cain in his immaturity says, am I my brother's keeper? The answer was yes, you are. The answer was you are. You were meant to be one who relates to him not as competition, but as one that you care about, one that you're responsible for. You and I were meant to be a gift to each other. Are we? We do well to ask that. Am I living as a gift to others, or am I merely looking for people to just somehow affirm me? We were meant to be a gift. And I know that's very hard for some of us because there is this natural part of us that feels that if we're responsible for others, that's just like a trip that we won't live up to, we won't do a good job of. We want to have freedom from responsibility because we fear that we're going to fail at it. And I think we do well to realize that that is the dilemma we need to resolve inside. I think this is especially important perhaps for men, or I'm much more aware of it within men, that for us as men, when we're young boys, we have this question inside, and I know it's shared by women, I just know it's acutely shared by boys, which is, do I have what it takes to make it in the world? In other words, there's a part of us that wants to take responsibility, heroic responsibility. We want to be respected. We want to be honorable. We want to be able to make that difference. But we're so afraid that we're going to fail at it, that we can't fit into the hero's suit. that we just dream about it and then we withdraw from even trying. And we kind of withdraw from that call to be able to go and truly be one who makes a difference in the world. And Jesus is here to say, you don't get it. If you just join me, you can be the hero. My suit isn't a Superman suit. My suit can fit you well. You can join me in making the difference that I've come to bring into this world. When you try to do it of your own accord, meaning like out of yourself, like you're going to fix the world, you can't do it. You've got to understand that what you need to do is just join God in what he's doing, and you'll find that you can actually make that difference, and you can rise up and engage it. There's a rabbi named Rabbi Loy who did his work in looking at how God calls us with expectations and that we shouldn't fear them. Knowing that many young people will say, well, I need to just be free. I need to be free of any responsibility for other people. Somehow that's my truest freedom. And the truth that Rabbi Loy says is no. When you think that way, you don't realize, but when people expect something from you, when life gives you expectations, responsibility, it means it's taking you seriously. He says when we don't embrace our responsibility for others, we're excluded. From what? From life. We have no place in this world. We have no place in life itself. Our place in life is to realize that we do matter, that we were created to be gifted, we're created to have the power to choose. This is what we see over and over and what Jesus is bringing to bear. And this leads to the second thing we see in Jesus, and that is that love gives with purpose. Love is not merely like, I just go and serve people by any women wish they have. No, it's about the fact that we see in Jesus, he actually was serving the Father's will and what the Father wanted to do. The Father knows who people are. He cares about people, and he wants us to be those who co-affirm those things. We don't try to fix the world by thinking we have the answers to everything. We really join God in what he is doing. That's what Jesus did. He says, I do the will of my Father, and I'm inviting you to join me in doing that. He is inviting each of us to be those who affirm the things, the truth of God in this broken world. How do we do that? Like, what is it we can bring to others? What does that purpose look like? Why, I imagine many things. I think Jesus gave us a little hint when he said things like, well, love your neighbor as yourself, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Essentially, we all know what will serve other people because we ourselves want the same things. So think about what someone wants, what would serve them. If they're lonely, you kind of know what that's about. If they're feeling like they're meaningless, you know what that's. And so join that. But in particular, perhaps, there's no two ways more central to doing that than this. One is we can give our time to serve others. We don't just give it all away, like we just have no ability to, like we're just out there kind of just throwing our lives into the wind of every need. But when there's a need that presents itself before you, as a limited human being, you will have limited engagement with people. See that you can give time. You can give your presence to that situation to meet that moment. Jesus did it so beautifully. We see him constantly making his way towards something else, another destination, another responsibility. But when there was a need before him, he stopped and he knew that he didn't need to be afraid of that need. He engaged it. He chose to meet that purpose in the moment, and then he moved on to what he was doing. We can give our time. Every time you choose to do it, we can serve it. Serve that purpose. When we discern there's a need that we can meet or at least be present with, the second thing is that we can use our words to bless others. We might think words don't really matter because we live with just a world of so many words. They're just all about, like a swirl of noise. But in the midst of all that noise, we're reminded that words have the capacity to speak life. And they can speak death. We could find that every day to be true, where people are almost speaking death. They're kind of killing things but with words. But we can actually speak life, and there are people who need that right word that speaks life, that affirms the truths of God to them and for them. And you and I have that capacity to do that. We can bless people with our words every day, every day. And there's more power than we really know. I just sometimes need to stop and think, wow, my kids or a friend or somebody, why is it that I'm not thinking about what they probably need to hear? And I think of that, God starts to sharpen that, and then we need to be able to speak that. Not to bring division, but to be those who bring that which blesses what is good. And finally, we learn from Jesus that love gives from eternal love. In other words, there's a source to trying to give away. And I think this is so vital because we generally think that, again, we live in a limited world. So how do I give myself away without just not existing when it's all over, right? If I pour myself out, I'm what? Empty. If I give myself away, then I'm lost. I cannot be found. I will not exist. And Jesus says, here's one that'll really throw you. It's actually not the way it works. You may recall when he said these words, very challenging to us. In the Gospel of Matthew 16, we read, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his or her cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will what? Lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will actually find it, find their life. He's calling us to follow him in the same pattern of life, where he gave his life on the cross. Now, Jesus knows it's our cross. We cannot be the ones who die on a cross and are crucified to atone for the sins of humanity. Only Jesus could come from God and provide that kind of sacrifice. But he is saying this, you and I are called to give ourselves for the sake of others. In fact, he's calling us to follow him in that kind of pattern. And he says that somehow, as we do it, we will actually find ourselves. And that's kind of the head turner. How do you find yourself? But think with me for a moment. When was Jesus ever more truly reflecting the very nature of divine love than when he was on the cross giving himself? Jesus was never more fully shining forth the divine nature than when he gave himself. You and I are never more truly ourselves than when we join in God's self-giving nature, ever. When you and I act selfishly, we kind of feel like I am the worst version of myself, you know? Those moments where you're like, I am so bad. But let me ask you something. Don't we all know that actually when we act sacrificially, especially when nobody sees it, when it's kind of got this purity, like when you give some extended time to a neighbor that nobody else sees, or to a friend on the phone, or you go out of your way for somebody, and it really does take some real sacrifice. Or maybe you help at the pantry, and you do that for a few hours, and you're exhausted afterwards. Let me ask you something. In those moments, I would suggest that you and I will generally feel two things. And we've probably all had at least one or two in our lives. I mean, like where we really went, wow, that was a big deal. I really ended up giving a whole day or a weekend or something to helping someone, and it really took a lot. In those moments, I'd say we generally feel two things. One, closer to God. Like I feel closer, more right with God in this moment than I ever do. Like I feel more naturally, oh God, I sense I'm kind of in tune with you, joined with you, right with you. And the second thing, we feel better about ourselves than any other moment there is. We feel more like this is my best version. Isn't that interesting? When we actually give ourselves sacrificially for others, we actually feel more like we're aligned with God, and that is actually where we should be aligned because it's the best in us. And therefore, we need to embrace the great gift that there is in giving ourselves with purpose and by choice, because those two things are vital. We're not talking about just kind of like giving ourselves in some purposely way or allowing others to take, but by choice, for purpose. This is what Jesus was teaching us to do. And in the end of the day, I believe that we really have to come to this, that we are either self-existing beings that just exist in our own with no belonging to others. You're just like this organic material for which there is no meaningful connection. And you might as well just live to survive, go full on selfish. Or we were actually created in the image of God to belong to each other in such a way as that as we live into that belonging, that responsibility, we actually find the kind of connection that we were meant to know. So as we close this time, but also just this whole series, I just want to say this in closing, a couple things. One is, maybe you're one who's just been exploring who Jesus is. I just was meeting with somebody in between our gatherings who said they just saw a banner and wanted to come and engage what Christians might take up in terms of building better relationships. And they've really valued this. So maybe you're just exploring kind of who Jesus is. My challenge, my encouragement to you is think about what you think is really true, what makes the best sense, what is really true about humanity and what you long for. And I think if you've looked carefully over these weeks, and you'll continue to do so, that you'll see that Jesus reveals that like no other. That no one reveals what is truly good like Jesus. And that he alone is the one who came to really help us be right and set right with God. Nobody else came and gave their life to bring and bear that forgiveness. He took our sin, our separation upon himself. And it all begins in that ability to begin to be loved by God and live in that love. Jesus said, I want you to be able to come home like the prodigal son, come home and live in the house and the heart of the Father. That's what Jesus has for each of us. And when you live out of that, you will learn once again how to love others and be that which creates God's family again. That's the invitation, and I encourage you to continue in that journey to see and to listen to what is so distinct in Jesus. And for all of us, I really deeply believe that this is an invitation to spend our lives living towards building better relationships. And as I said at the very beginning, we just aren't going to do well if we think, I need to learn 5 little statements, 5 academic truths, that once I know the academic truths, I will do it. Like that always leads to frustration, because like you get the notes from the seminar and they're on your shelf, and 5 years later you can't remember what they are, and even if you did, they're not really doing you good. We're looking at the 5 most core truths about how Jesus teaches us to love. It is a guide. I want this to guide my life. It will be living into those patterns. So what have I done? I have brought these to put before myself. And so this week I summarized, kind of tightened down, what are those 5 patterns we've been looking at. And if you will be on our weekly email, we will have that included in the weekly email. I want to invite you to join me in putting these on the refrigerator, putting them on before your desk, and living for the next several years with the focus of how can I cultivate these patterns in my life? Because that's what it takes. And in the end, it can really change us. And I give this final thought that I saw Arthur Brooks actually took when he was trying to invite people to think about this. And I thought it was really helpful and can help us connect. He said, everybody needs first to think about yourself in 5 years. Think of a version of yourself 5 years from now. So if you're 20, think of your 25-year-old self. If you're 80, think of your 85-year-old self, because I'm believing for it, okay? So think of that self, and then think about it being happy. Think of yourself 5 years from now. Think of a happy, content self. We're not going to give time to be able to do this right and well right now, but I want to give you the thought of this, because I think it helps point to something. So imagine that self. Now, imagine what were 5 things that made a difference? What would be 5 things that would help make a difference in terms of providing you to find that happiness? Like, would serve your contentment in 5 years? Like if I was really picturing myself in 5 years, really content, like really feeling like I'm living well, what would be the 5 things I could imagine, or 5 things? Then he encourages people to do that. Then he says, order them. Like figure out which ones are going to make the most difference, but they're the top 5. And then he says, finally, now take the top 2 and make a decision to manage them, to take control of them, to actually try to make changes that live into those. And this is what he said has always proven true. The bottom 3 will generally be about extrinsic things, like I want to have more money, or I want to succeed more or achieve them things. The top 2, we will, if we reflect, will almost always be about relationships. We generally will realize that's going to make the most difference. So what he's really saying at the end is you come around to saying, I need to manage it, because life will not itself just allow us to start to love well or build better relationships. But if we become aware that I want to build my life, as was said earlier, Dr. Murthy said, build your life around people, towards people, into relationships, loving like God would have you love. That is where, if we do that intentionally, we are headed to good things. I want to invite you to join me. Would you stand with me as we pray? I invite you to pray with me, if you will. Let's just take a moment before God, in the presence of God. God, we come as those who are in different ways, just aware that we can be alone, and not always alone in the best sense, but sometimes lonely, where we are not really connected. Some of us that may be acute, some of us we have a social life, but we're not as connected as we sense that we long to be. We come as those, and we pray that we would really receive your heart for us, not to be alone, and your provision. And we live in a world that the idea of giving ourselves just for the sake of others is hard sometimes to grasp. We're kind of afraid. We feel like we're in this world competing for some limited resources. We long for affection and affirmation. But you've come to show us that we will find it when we give it. We pray that you would help us to see that, Jesus, you are the one who's come to truly restore us into the love that is eternal and unlimited. Pray that you would really restore our hearts to dare to live into you, to give away ourselves for the sake of others. That you would help us to know that we truly are gifts, and our greatest power comes when we choose to serve others with your purposes. So we say, lead us in giving as you give. Jesus, we receive afresh your own forgiveness, your own restoration. As you took our separation from the God that we walked away with, that we went astray, and you have given us a chance to come back. We pray these things in your name. Amen. And I invite us, let's respond in worship.
Let me be filled with kindness and compassion for the one for whom you loved and gave your Son for humanity. Increase my life.